morning, everyone. I'm Earl Watkins, and I'm chair of the Education Committee, the State Education Committee for the Mississippi State Conference NAACP. And welcome to the first session of the day of the education session. And our session title is "The Truth Will Make You Free." The truth will make you free. And certainly that should sound familiar to most of you, if not all of you, because it comes from the book of John, chapter 8, verse 32, and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And I titled the session specifically that this morning because there's a concern about whether there are those out there who really want us to know the truth about our nation's history, to know the truth about how systems work, to know the truth about what is necessary for us to be the kind of country that we want the United States to be, for all of us to be the citizens that we should be, that has made this nation great and that will continue to make this session great. In this session, you will learn the meaning of critical race theory, its origin, and its role in education. We will explore ideas about truth-telling in America, why there is opposition to it, and the pitfalls that the lack of truth-telling will present in our country, for our citizens, and most importantly, for our children. Now, I learned that we are the only live session for the entire conference, and so I'm excited about this opportunity to engage with you in a Q&A session at the end of this particular session. So think about what's being said. We look forward to getting questions from you as we move throughout this particular presentation. Our key speaker for this morning is Jalea Lyles-Dunn, who is the Learning for Justice Director for the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama. And our other panelists are Rosalind McCoy. Ms. McCoy is the president of the Jackson Council PTA, PTSA in Jackson, Mississippi. We also have Patrick Weems. Patrick is the executive director of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center in Sumner, Mississippi. And finally, we have Raymond Russell. Mr. Russell is the principal of Leflore County High School in the Greenwood-Leflore Consolidated School District, and his school is located in Itta Bena, Mississippi. And we only have 45 minutes for this session, so I'm not going to prolong the conversation in order for us to get started. So let us begin with our key speaker, who is Ms. Jalea Lyles-Dunn. Ms. Dunn, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the being a part of such a great panel of conversation and dialogue and great people. We're going to get started like Dr. Watkins shared. We only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to move us in the conversation to get us set up for so many good dialogue to follow with our panelists. Of course, like Dr. Watkins shared, the title is "The Truth Will Make You Free." He was very clear to say it will make you free, and he gave us a good scripture to ground it in. I also want to connect with why I think this resonates and should resonate with us. I think of the Zimbabwean proverb, until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. I hope that sits with you in your spirit to understand that we need to make sure that we tell our own story, and why the truth in this conversation is so pertinent and so critical at this point of our time and in point of history particularly. As we move on, I want to go ahead and dig immediately into what this topic of critical race theory is about and what's happening. The one quote that stood out and that can frame this conversation, because it's such a complex conversation. I know you all been hearing things from the news, from the media feeds, from your colleagues, from friends, and you're just like, what is this and what does it mean? And I'm so happy to engage further after this presentation, beyond the presentation, with anyone as we decide how do we talk about racism in America. And pretty much that is what this conversation of critical race theory, where it lands, is a conversation about race. And I love this quote. I read it on a presentation a few weeks ago, and I was so moved by it. And it said, racism is so American that when you protest it, people think you're protesting America. So immediately when I hear about critical race theory, a counter argument I'm hearing, the anti-critical race theory's argument is that it's saying that we are not for America. And Dr. Watkins said it so clearly. We love this country. We are for this country. We are a part of this country. And we're all standing to shape and make America the America and the democracy it has promised so many of us to be for us. And so when we're protesting racism, it's not a fight against America. It's a fight against what is going to harm the promises of America. And so I want to introduce the name Derek Bell. We've heard this name come up. This is one of the pioneers of coining what critical race theory, this language, this word, this rhetoric we've been hearing today. And when he talks of critical race theory, is embedded in this conversation of working towards segregations and what does it look like in these landmark cases to really move our civil rights back in the early 1950s, the 60s, the early cases of school segregation and desegregation. And how does this look, and how do we fight this legally? How do we fight these legal battles? ultimately, I will say that this legal scholar Derek Bell and others realize that as much as legal fights and how much is legal landmark cases and fights that we put toward racism in America and making sure our children have the equity and equality it needs, racism is so pertinent and it's still there. And we feel like we're being restricted in what equality looks like. And so that's the bigger argument. So no matter how many times we get Ruby Bridges in the school, no matter how many times we build Rosenwald School so that young people have a fair and a full education from their community, no matter how many times we desegregate schools and we march and fight for the right laws and policies and legal policies, racism continues to creep up. And that's when the term critical race theory was really explored in that conversation. I want to go really deep quickly into the 5 tenets of critical race theory and what we've been hearing and what you've been hearing to just really give you a little bit more clarity on why this term is such a hot topic, and many people call it the boogeyman. Well, I want to go back to our topic. We need to know the truth, and we need to make sure we are very clear. So we talk and we do our part as change agents in this work around critical race theory and around racism as a whole in our country. So number one, a tenet of critical race theory, and the tenets are the different components of what makes critical race theory this concept, this theory of thought. It's a school of thought. It's a theory. It's the way a group, a belief system, how we see America's shape and how we see this nation shape. And so based on the works of Derek Bell and other legal scholars, they realize that racism is ordinary. It's not aberrational, meaning that racism is real. It's here. It is pertinent. It happens. It is a part of our lives, and it is dictating the way we live our lives here in America. The argument you've been seeing is that, and in different media and different pieces and proposals, is that equality is what we should be not talking about and not equity. And so there's two things. That equity implies that means that there is a group that is not treated fairly, and there's a marginalized group, and we have to put measures and procedures and policies in place that make sure that group is put to the level that they should be put in so that we all are equal. Equality assumes that we're all getting the same across the board. Racism suggests that that's not the case, that equity is needed in those conversations. So you'll hear anti-CRT arguments saying that is inequality and not equity. Don't be confused. Equity lets us know that racism is in place and that everybody's not treated equal. The second tenet of critical race theory is the interest convergence one. And this pretty much means that the interests of the oppressed and those in control are shared. Right now, and that conversation is saying that if one group benefits, such as the oppressed or those who impacted most by racism, those who are not most impacted by racism, pretty much is white America at this, and not it just means that white America doesn't benefit from racism because there's no race that puts them at a lower level, level of inferiority. When those two, if there's changes or progress for one group, it means that the other group benefits from it as well. That things are not moving forward for the less marginalized group, and the other group didn't receive any benefits from it. The argument you may hear is that these kind of fights talks about racism is a disruption of progress in civil rights. And I want to give you a better example in that term, this type of tenet. Think about, you hear people talk about the abolition of slavery, and they would say President Lincoln freed the slaves. That's a great thing. But we also know that the slavery, abolition of slavery, was for peace in the Union. That was a need for union. So there's also this one side. There was convergence here. Each side benefited. Yes, slavery was abolished and abolitionists were pleased and we were all satisfied with that racial progress. But another side, which was the Union, had peace and they were able to reconcile with their differences. So you understand there's this interest of convergence that critical race theory is implying in this type of theory. The third one is race is socially constructed, meaning that race isn't real. Race, we know we are all human. Biologically, there's not a difference between us as people, but we know socially it has been constructed to make one race superior of other races. An anti-CRT argument you will hear saying color blindness, we don't see color, meritocracy is real, that people benefit not based on the color of their skin, but who they are and by the content of their character. As you've been seeing, that quote been used in so many ways. Do not be misled by those kinds of conversations of color blindness. Critical race theory says that race is socially constructed, and we know that we are all people, we are all humans, but our race itself has been put into place to dictate how we live our lives in this country and pretty much in this global world as well. Another fourth tenet of critical race theory is that storytelling and counter storytelling is important. meaning that we have to hear the stories of people who live these experiences of racism. We have to hear the stories of people of color, people of social different social identities, that we need to hear what people experience, how they live, and let them tell their stories, and let us counter what we've been hearing or told that may not be true about our own stories and our own histories. The anti-critical race theory, this is one of the largest ones we've been hearing about, is the prohibition of honest history and truth telling in schools, saying that this is there's one way of telling this story. This is how our history looks, and this is what it is, and it applies for everyone. That's not true. Our diversity and our stories of different cultures really tell a true story, and we should keep fighting for that type of storyteller. And critical race theory is saying that we should uplift the storyteller and the counter storyteller of our community and of each and the people who make up our communities. And then finally, a fifth tenet of critical race theory is that whites have been recipients of civil rights legislation. And this is going again, understanding that restrictive nature of equality that I talked about with Derek Bell earlier in the previous slides, saying that although progression toward racial justice we have some racial justice progression, there are still benefits for another group of a white group versus a non-white group. The undermining of public schools and redirecting public dollars, the segregation academies, once Brown versus Board of Education happened, there are still benefits for other recipients of that are not that are white recipients of civil rights legislations. Other groups have decided to fight for legislation, civil rights legislations, but while they were doing so, white groups were able to segregate their schools, were able to get private donors and private funding and to do other things. So that's the fifth theory of critical race theory, which led Derek Bell and others to say, hey, race in America is embedded structurally in so much of what we do. We have to look at these tenets and really dissect them and pull them apart to understand how it's impacting our lives and what we do. And so there you have the critical race theory conversation. These are big tenets and big bold words, but ultimately, you all, we live this life. We understand how it looks with us every day and what it feels like and what this looks like. And I ask you all to look at each tenet and really dissect and pull out and put your own words to how we talk about these tenets of critical race theory, so that you're much more informed and much more able to inform everyone else. Largely, as we talk of critical race theory, as in a big picture, we got to see it within a system of control. This is not an anomaly or something that fell from the sky and then we just decided, oh, we're talking about critical race theory today. This is a part of a larger system of control. And I ask that we understand what systems of control look like and how this nation was built on a large system of control that pretty much birthed the concept of white supremacy. So I love this quote from Miss Ella Baker from 1969. And she says, in order for us as a poor and oppressed people to become a part of society that is meaningful, we must learn to think in radical terms. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. This has always been the case, everyone, that these have been systems put in place to keep groups under control, that one group benefits and another does not. Although there are arguments saying this is not true, and we're all in the same place, and we all build ourselves up together, and we all work and grow together. Unfortunately, our country has been built on that concept of control. Dr. King says it's best in 1968. And remember now, although the very opponents of critical race theory are using Dr. King's quote of content of character versus the color of our skin. That was earlier. That was, and I have the March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech. But by 1968, Dr. King was not embraced by the country the way he had been before. And in 1968, when his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos of Community, he's very clear saying the attempt to give more of a sanction to a profitable system gave birth to the doctrine of white supremacy. He's talking about slavery. He's talking about this country became so profitable about being able to enslave people and put that system in place that it could have to justify by now making one race inferior over another race, under another race, and making one race superior over another race. And hence the doctrine of white supremacy begins. White supremacy is the basis of how do we use systems of control in our nation today. And so if you look at, as Michelle Alexander, she has described it so much great in chapter 1 of Rebirth of Caste in her book, The New Jim Crow. And she goes so on to begin with the birth of slavery, which is with system. But then she talks about how each system is born and then there's death of it. And that's the death comes from these levels of resistance that we have to keep doing, you all. We have to keep pushing. We have to keep fighting. This war on racism is true. We have to keep undermining what white supremacy means for our nation. And so the birth of slavery comes, and then it's the death of slavery. But then after the death of slavery, while we're celebrating that we have abolished slavery, that same system has the power to uproot itself back up into the birth of Jim Crow. And then while we're fighting and fighting toward Jim Crow and dismantling Jim Crow, the death of Jim Crow comes, but then another system can rise out of that. And right now, we are in the midst of watching a new system of control through this critical race theory conversation, this anti-critical race theory conversation. So I want you all to understand that this is more of a system of control. It is not about just a random conversation about critical race theory, but understand its context of what it looks like and what it means for this nation and why it's so important. So then we're in the eagles who thought it was chickens, which is pretty much a story that I thought was so magnificent to explain when we talk about this systems conversation. And in this conversation, we understand that eagles were coming in from all of these eagles, these baby eagles were brought in from a country, their own native land, brought into a place, another place, and they were made to think they were chickens. And they was ridiculed in chicken yard. They were put in places not feel special, not feel important. And their stories were heard. They didn't know their history, and their lives turned out to be one that was limited and restrictive. And this story of eagles who thought they were chickens and what our children are experiencing today when they're thinking about this critical race theory of saying they can't tell who they are, they can't explore themselves, they can't embrace the diversity, what their communities mean and what they feel like a part of their own lives. And so why now? Why schools? Why this? The 2020 summer protest shows it all. It shows that young people are coming together to fight and to really put another depth of a system in place. And they're dismantling systems. They're going towards structural racism, not individual injustices, but for structural, for everyone to be involved in. And saying racism is true and it is embedded into our lives and into our systems and the way we live. They are fighting that. That alarms white America. This is a threat, a multinational, a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy undermines white supremacy. Is it a threat to white supremacy? And so there's a threat to a system that this country has built itself on for years and years. But why children of 20, why our children, why our schools? 2020, children of color are the largest population in our nation today. They are our future. They are the change agents to really make democracy true and real for everyone in this country. And that means white children, black children, Asian children, Native American, all of our children coming together as one. And I love the way Dr. Yolanda Sela Ruiz calls it the snippets of historical literacy, saying that we can't erase the status quo of race. We have to tell our history. We cannot erase history. It provides the status quo of racism to live on. And pretty much saying that if all of our young people live together in the same space and things, this allows all students to step more fully into their own humanity and who we all can be together. Not just black children against white children. This is not a black and white conversation. By far, no means it is. And I don't want us to engage in that way. This is for all children to have a space to really help us shape what this nation could be for ourselves and the futures beyond them. And so what we want you to do with what you know and what you have, just understand it right now. We are a part of historical legacies of change. We have been fighting the war of American racism from day one, from when it started. We are a group of resilient people. We have allies across this nation, across this world, and it has been through NAACP, who has been here so long, through other organizations of social change as well. And also, we want to call you to action. We need first for all you just to be able to disrupt the myths. Understand, like we said from the beginning, the truth will make you free. Tell the truth. Let's talk. Let's have dialogue. Let's not let white supremacy threaten the multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that we all been promised to as citizens of this nation. And also, let's continue to learn together. A link has been put forth for you all at www.learningforjustice.org/NAACP21, just for a list of resources and opportunities so we can all learn how to forge an honest and authentic conversations about racism in America. So please utilize these resources, for they are for you. They've been designed just for you so we can begin to be honest about the conversations and what we need to know. And if we don't know enough, let's make sure we know the truth so we can move forward and we all can be free together. And finally, in my last few seconds, I want us to commit to sharing these words to all the young eagles who are in our care and our reach, because we don't want any chickens. All of our young people should be eagles, all of them. And it's from the book, All Because You Matter by Tammy Charles. And on the day the universe was created and you were thought of, dreamed of, carried like a knapsack full of wishes, as planets, stars, moons took their places, making room for you, your people, their dreams, your future, all because since the beginning of time, you mattered. They mattered. We mattered and always will. With that, I want to say thank you. I hope this was helpful. I look forward to further conversations beyond this presentation. And I'm so thankful to be able to be in this conversation around what we need as educators in this work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Jalea. That was an awesome presentation. And one of the things I want to highlight that you said, this is not black or white. It really is about us as a country. As a matter of fact, critical race theory is not relegated to just black folk and white folk. When you look into the Latinx community, there's an application of critical race theory there. When you look in the Native American community, there is an application of critical race theory there. When you look in the Asian community in America, there's an application of critical race theory. It is not just about the African American community. It really is about the application of this thinking, this framework of thought about how race and racism is applied in systems in our country. And keep in mind now, there is no curriculum called critical race theory. It is not a curriculum. It is only a school of thought. It's an academic concept. It is a way of evaluating how systems impact different groups of people. But when you look at the opposition in terms of how they want to attack this particular concept, it's going to now impact the way we teach curriculum in America. We have to be sure that we tell the truth about what history is in our country, and we have to ensure that children get what I would say an age appropriate, well-defined approach to understanding history. And I said age appropriate intentionally because we know that there are certain times in which children should be introduced to certain concepts, to be introduced to certain facts, because we are all in our time of development, and only information should be implemented inside of the public school at a certain time. And I will defend that. But I don't think we need to put ourselves in a position to defend a legal construct that appears in post-secondary education. But inside of K-12, we must passionately defend the accurate teaching of our history. And I'll defer to our panelists now, and I'll begin with Rosalind McCoy, our PTA Jackson Council PTA president in Jackson, Mississippi. You have 3 minutes for reflection. Unmute.
I'm so sorry. So good morning, everybody. And I second everything that was saying. And Jalela, I do have to commend you, shadowing Dr. Watkins. That was an amazing presentation, and it pointed out a lot of key and often overlooked points. So I do appreciate and applaud you for that. In addition to that, I also absolutely support all of the thought of Dr. Watkins, who also reiterated Jalela's points, but he also pointed out how age-appropriate and well-defined curriculums are necessary in our K through 12 schools. And we cannot expect what we probably see as research and theory and all of that stuff at the college level. We cannot expect it to look the same way in our K through 12 classrooms. Going back to a point that Jalela made in terms of Derek Bell's critical race theory, racism is deeply rooted in America, and it has reasserted itself after every attempt to eliminate it. So his thought was that it was permanent. And my thoughts mirror that in a lot of ways, because I feel like it is permanent until it is not permanent. And the only way that it will become not permanent, even as we dissect it, using your words, Jalela, as we dissect it, we have to start being honest about what America's history really is. And I also appreciate how you pointed out, Jalela, how just because that we're talking about critical race theory and we're protesting all of the negative things that are being casted into the space about what it is, but really is not. It does not mean that we're protesting America. It does not mean that we're fighting against a country that we hate and all of these terrible things that people who oppose critical race theory are trying to make everybody believe. In that belief, I've also heard terms that people like us are thinking of, are trying to cast out Black supremacy and false histories and all of this fake wokeness and all of these sometimes offensive terms that people can use just because all we're trying to do is make a level space for all people, especially all children. Dr. Watkins pointed out the point that race is not a factor here. It's not about being Black or white. It's not about being anything. It's about being human in America. And all of our experiences should be valued as experiences. And just because I'm Black doesn't mean that I need to be put to a lower standard just because the country, yes, was founded on white supremacy, but considering that we're the 2021 age or whatever we're going to call it, we have to start revealing what the truth actually is and educating people based on facts, not theories, not beliefs, not all of these things, but what actually happened in our country, especially as it relates to how it affected the lives of Black people. And until we start doing that, yes, I'm going back to Derek Bell's point, racism is permanent. It's permanent until we come into agreement somewhere that change has to take place, and it has to take place starting with truth. And that's the only thing that's going to make us absolutely free.
Thank you, Rosalind. Those were awesome comments and an awesome reflection. Let's move on to Patrick Weems, Executive Director of the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. Patrick?
So I'll piggyback off the theme of today, which is truth telling. And one of my favorite shows right now is a show called Ted Lasso. If you haven't seen it, it's worth your time. Hilarious show. The quote in that show is, "Truth will set you free, but first it will hurt like hell." And I think that is part of what we're going through. There's a saying that says culture trumps policy. The people who are against critical race theory are first and foremost against race, right? The biggest problem we have addressing racial inequity is that folks deny that there is a problem in the first place. As a white man growing up in Mississippi, I was birthed in that culture, right? The only thing I was taught about race was that Dr. King, Rosa Parks sat down and Dr. King stood up, and we're all free, and that we are now in a post-racial society. Where we have to align ourselves towards is that truth telling and towards a shared collective past. We don't have a shared history right now. Worst case scenario, I was taught the lost cause, right? Informally, not through K through 12, but informally through just growing up as a white person in Mississippi. We have to get to a point of that shared history. And I think it's not only K through 12's responsibility, but it's all institutions, especially cultural ones, to expand that narrative. Our organization, the Emmett Till Interpretive Center, started because for 50 years, nobody wanted to talk about Emmett Till in Tallahatchie County, even though we were the site of the injustice. And when we began putting up our historical markers, the first one, someone wrote KKK on it. Then they sprayed it with acid. Then they shot it up. And there's been this repetitive of every time they take it down, we put it back up a little bit stronger. Our fourth marker, unfortunately, is bulletproof. And it stands at the site where Emmett Till's body came out of the Tallahatchie River. What we want to press upon, and I guess my last point, is that history is a human right. It is just as important as the air and water that we drink, that we need to keep teaching truthful history, because it is important to our humanity and to our country.
Patrick, there's a couple of things that you said that I definitely want to highlight. Two things. You said we need a shared history, and right now we don't have a shared history. And how do we see that in our schools right now? If race were not an issue in public schools, there will no need to be a focus on African American history as a course. It will be integrated in history of America and the United States in a way that we can see how all of us contributed to the strength of these United States. That's one way of looking at how we're dealing with the impact of race and white supremacy inside of our nation and inside of our communities. The other thing you said, that when they would damage or knock down the sign, it came back stronger every time. And I think that's almost like a rallying cry. If you knock me down, I'm coming back stronger. So the question then becomes, how do we come back stronger as a people every time we're hit with these issues? Because we're going to be presented with them time and time again. And you said the truth is going to hurt for a little while. It's going to hurt for a little while, because it's going to open our eyes to see things that either we had not noticed before, and we actually see ourselves perpetuating some of the issues that are out there. And so it is not until the truth comes forth that we're not going to be able to address issues of equity and equality. Let's go on to our principal, Mr. Russell.
Yes, sir. Thank you for the opportunity. The core idea is that race is a social construct and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. Through my research, critical race theory essentially argues that racism is baked into all of the systems of American society, that any sort of neutral system is in fact a guise for racial power or racial superiority. For the record, my school does not teach CRT as a curriculum. Critical race theory, in my opinion, doesn't belong in K through 12 schools. That doesn't mean that we should not teach history as it happened. By teaching history the way it actually happened, it is a way of seeing, attending to, accounting for, tracing, and analyzing the ways that race and racial inequality is produced. The way that racial inequality is facilitated and the ways that our history has created these inequalities that now can be almost effortlessly reproduced unless we attend to and point out these inequalities. Our primary job as educators is to teach, all right? And we owe it to our kids to teach them the truth, all right? And not necessarily teaching critical race theory, but all of our kids will know exactly what happened in the past. So as the lead educator, the lead teacher at the school, it is my job to make sure all of our students understand critical race theory, not necessarily the way it was designed, but they know exactly what's going on in their past.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. And what I'm hearing from you is that we need to do more than just teach the who, the what, the when, and where of history. But in an age-appropriate way, we have to make sure that we teach the how and the why of our history as well. Because in K-12, we are always focused on critical thinking as a tool for our children. Because if they're only able to apply rote memory skills, they can only quote facts and figures. And that's not the kind of child that we're trying to produce from our K-12 system. We want children who can think critically about what's happening around them and be able to take the things that they've been taught them and be able to apply them in ways that would create new thoughts, new things. We only get progression through critical thinking, through application of knowledge. We don't get progression. We don't get innovation as a result of just rote memory of facts and figures. But now, if the state of Wisconsin has its way, its legislation could potentially ban the use of certain words. For example, if Wisconsin has its way, you might not hear the term critical race theory at all, but that may not be a big deal. But what about social emotional learning? You might not hear about social emotional learning in Wisconsin if its law is passed. You won't hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You won't hear about culturally responsive teaching. You won't hear about racism. You won't hear colorism. You won't hear conscious and unconscious bias. Critical ethnic studies. Now, in Wisconsin, they use the terminology critical ethnic studies. But in Mississippi, could that also mean African American studies? Could that mean Asian studies? So then if you start attacking terms, then you'll begin to attack curriculum and content. So that's why it's important for us to not get caught up in the term critical race theory, but to put people on the spot and say, well, what history are we going to teach then? What are we going to say about how America came to be? What are we going to do to ensure that our kids understand that we don't repeat the past? And for those of us who are as old as I am, I think I might be the oldest one on the screen, and those who are participating online, some of us might remember that some of our history books did not include a great deal of content about people of color, if any at all. And remember now, in public ed, we know that whatever you are exposed to over and over and over again, your mind is going to codify in your brain what is to be as a result of what you are exposed to. So if I only show you people of one race, then your mind would say that my race is not important or I did not contribute. So in order to tell a factual history, a truth-telling experience, we have to make sure that we teach a full history and help people understand why things exist as they do. I've been looking at the comments to see if we have any questions inside of the comments, and I have not seen any questions just yet. But I do have a question for Jalea. If we're talking about taking certain terms away from the language of how we teach kids, what impact could that have actually on what's happening in K-12 education? If you don't hear social emotional learning, because in Mississippi, we just put in place standards for social emotional learning to help children. So what happens if we start attacking terms? Jalea?
I like that question. It means that it's going to be, we won't provide the services. We won't provide the needed support. That's those terms defined. We don't have terms to define what type of work we're doing. So social emotional learning, we know what that means. We know that means that we need to look at what a child, their background, what their experiences, their whole self, they bring their whole self to the school environment. We don't have these terms to define what that work looks like. We just started erasing, and we just began to erase those services, what those approaches, those best practices of education. So also we're embracing best practices, things we've learned to be more inclusive, to embrace diversity, to embrace culture, to bring the whole child to school. Once we just disconnect and just say those words don't mean anything, they'll write them out the curriculum. We won't do them. Nothing that if we don't monitor and we don't make ourselves and define ourselves around the work that we do, we're not going to do the work. And so we need those terms. Those terms have brought us miles, and progress towards such good work. We need those terms to keep moving us miles and miles ahead. If we erase them, they just push us back further and further.
Awesome. You know, it's amazing when you really think about this as opponents of this discussion, and I won't even say of critical race theory, of this discussion about race. The strategy is to attack language and create new language. So if I can take away your language, then I'm going to then attack what you teach. But also I'm giving folk new language, so I have to replace it with new language. Then I'm creating a new mental construct about this. And we never really learn the depths of what's before us. And so, Patrick, I'd like to come to you with this question. Again, you're working with the Emmett Till Interpretive Center. I know you're doing a lot of work in that particular area. What does it mean, or what would it mean if we're not able to really tell the story of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old who was brutally murdered in the Mississippi Delta? Not being able to tell that story means what for our young people today?
Well, I'll just tell my personal experience. So I had a teacher who went out of her way to teach me about Emmett Till my senior year of high school. Her name was Michelle Purdy. Shout out to Michelle. And what it did for me, one is I had not learned about Emmett Till for 18 years throughout my entire K through 12. So it taught me, one, it was this real puzzling moment, right? Why had this been hidden, right? This is a major international event that took place in Mississippi. At 18, you think you know everything. And it really befuddled me. It really threw my worldview into chaos, right? Like why was this missing? The second piece was that I learned about the Emmett Till generation. I learned about young people who heard about Emmett Till, were angry, who were 14, 15 years old. John Lewis was 15 when Emmett Till was tortured and murdered. And he decided to devote his life to civil rights and human rights because of what took place, right? So we begin to have a blueprint for how change is possible. When we see these things on the news, when we see incidents like George Floyd take place, we need to have history to remind us about how change is possible. Once we have that, we have hope. And hope was what has kept me in Mississippi. Otherwise, I think I would have left a long time ago. But knowing that young people made change in Mississippi, that young people came down to register people to vote, is incredible. And I think this is going to be a difficult task to teach these histories, right? We talked about the sign at the river site that's been vandalized multiple times. The last time it was vandalized, students from Ole Miss took pictures in front of it. 18 and 19-year-old students took pictures in front of it. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is it so difficult to teach the story of a 14-year-old child, even in 2021, right? And we have to continue to teach this story because we know it's liberating. It was liberating even for me as a white person growing up in Mississippi.
Thank you, Patrick. And there's a question in the comments there, why does the principal think that critical race theory should not be taught? And if you don't mind, Mr. Russell, I'll take a first stab, and then we're closing in on our time as well. And I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to give some feedback to to our audience around what are the takeaways and some of the things that we can do in our local communities to address this. And I would say this. Remember, critical race theory is a concept that was originated in the halls of law school. Not inside of K-12. It is a frame of thought. It is a theory that, when applied, gives you a view of looking at the impact of race on systems. Am I hitting that just right, Jalea? Okay, awesome. And so what I want to make sure of as a K-12 educator, that we're really not getting diverted from the real issue of telling the truth of our history, not getting caught up of a legal framework that originated in the halls of law school, and now someone has built it up so as this big and bad bear that it's now attacking our K-12 schools. You know, if once again, if Wisconsin has its way, we won't even be talking about multiculturalism that has been a part of our language in K-12 school for years. And so we want to make sure that folk are focusing on what the truth is and not getting caught up in a legal construct. And Mr. Russell, I'll come back to you as to give us about 30 seconds of takeaways for our participants who are in our online chat.
Yes, sir. Two things, Dr. Watkins. The war on attacking terms has already begun in our textbooks. Instead of calling slaves, they call them indentured servants or serfs or things of that nature. So it has already begun. And another reason why I don't think CRT should be taught in schools is because our primary focus is to create critical thinkers. So we need to give them the information that they need in order to be those critical thinkers, and instead of molding their minds to think a certain way. So we want them to be free thinkers and critical thinkers instead of giving them this theory and saying, this is it, this is the doctrine.
In other words, I would close it out by saying, you know, let's give the kids a way of thinking that's appropriate for their age level. And for those who want to attack it in law school, go to post-secondary and deal with it there. But we understand the question that's at hand here. Thank you for presenting that. Ms. McCoy.
Yes, sir.
Your takeaways for parents.
So for parents, I encourage everyone not only to get as educated as possible about critical race theory, because of all of the mixed messages and all of the negative things that are being casted into the air. It's very easy to get confused or further misled about things that are absolutely not true about us just trying to recognize how important our history is, how inclusive it needs to be in all things, especially as it relates to properly educating our upcoming generations of children. In addition to that, I also encourage the parent and community engagers to just look forward to expanding experiences for, I'm going to say, Black children. Look forward to creating different experiences, because I recall earlier in this conversation, Dr. Watkins described what books or school used to look like in terms of race, and only being able to identify with who we saw most in our textbooks, so who our teachers talked about most in their lectures or in their class lessons or whatnot. So I encourage our parent and community engagers to consider just expanding experiences for all children, yes, Black and white, so that the truth about not just the history, but what's actually going on right now in terms of the racism that we talked about earlier that is embedded in our country, expand the experiences so that children can start to learn that there are differences, and all people are not alike, and our Blackness does matter not the spaces that we're in. Not only does it matter, it is to be respected and it is to be valued, despite whatever the histories may have said about what Black was and was not. The truth of the matter is that it is and it will be. So I just encourage parents to dive deeper into critical race theory, come up with all of the terms. I can appreciate how our panelist, Mr. Russell, was open and honest about describing what school or looks like in, is it Itabena, LaFleur County? In LaFleur County, I can appreciate that, but I also appreciate his honesty about not calling it critical race theory. But even in that, I encourage parents, not just in his area, but especially in ours and all areas across the state of Mississippi, to dive deeper into the facts about this so that we can have more detailed conversations about this so that there's a mutual understanding. I'm going back to Mr. Williams' point about sharing. That was such a powerful word to me. It's important that we all enter into a space that where we're all thinking and talking about and actually living what's actually defined as truth, not necessarily beliefs and principles that can get kind of mixed up sometimes, but what's actually true. And our history and all things matters in terms of our Blackness, who we are, what our experiences were, and what our experiences currently are.
Thank you, Rosalind. And Patrick, would you give it 15 seconds of feedback?
I'll say this: it's not just up to K through 12, but we all have a responsibility to teach history. One opportunity is if you could go to tillnationalpark.org. We're trying to create a national park for Mamie and Emmett Till. tillnationalpark.org. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Jalea.
I say this: critical race theory, they've taken the word and they've won the messaging. You don't need to, our fight is going to be about defending critical race theory at this point. Our fight should be about making sure we're inclusive, it's diverse, that we're embracing all our children, whether it's their race, whether it's their sexuality, whether it's their gender, whatever it is. This is an attack on difference and diversity, and we have to have a diverse country in order to make democracy what it should be.
And I will end by saying we're not trying to say to anyone that critical race theory is not an important concept to address. What we are trying to say is that we want to make sure that inside of the K-12 system that we teach a truthful history and we teach kids to think critically, which is something we have always attempted to do in K-12. And I want to make sure that we continue to focus on what's age appropriate for our kids, and we do it in a way that is going to include everyone's history. That's what's most important. I hope that you have received a great deal of information, insight from the conversation. I want to thank Mr. Russell, Ms. McCoy, Mr. Weems, and certainly Ms. Dunn for all of that you brought to this presentation. It has been insightful, it's been intellectual, it's been thought-provoking, and I do hope our audience has received a great deal of insight as a result of participating in this session. And on that note, we will end the session. And remember, it's the truth that will make you free.